First of all, thank you to Sophia for the invitation to come and speak today. Thank you. Thank you to also to Peter and his colleagues for organizing, and for Ranjana, who is going to join me very, very soon in a conversation. I know it's kind of a little bit sort of late in the day, but I wanted to, I was invited to talk about my work in relation to researching art schools, and in particular researching the art school Kala Bhavan, which was established in 1919 by the poet Rabindranath Tagore at Santiniketan in West Bengal, what's now West Bengal. And I was also interested in one of the comments that was made at the end of the last presentation, the musical performance, about these kind of unstructured moments, because I think this is one of the very interesting aspects of some of these experimental forms of education that allow those moments of those unstructured moments to happen. And particularly in the UK, in the English context now, we have a kind of very financialized education system. So actually, these moments become ever rarer. But to give you a sort of history, I first visited Santiniketan in 1995, so quite a while ago, and I was really interested. I was actually, even then, I was doing research into art education. I was visiting different colleges in India and trying to set up connections between the college where I was teaching at that time, which was Loughborough College of Art, and colleges in India. And Santiniketan was the one that I really found very inspiring, partly because of its history going back to the early 20th century, but also because of this this very progressive, emancipatory idea about what art education should be. And since that time, I've worked on a number of different projects in relation to the school. The first one was called Santal Family, Positions Around an Indian Sculpture. And it was an exhibition that took one aspect of the campus, which was a sculpture by the artist Ramkinka Baij, called Santal Family, which is the representation of a group of Santal tribal people, migrant workers, that's made in this sort of almost sort of cubist style, but with a smattering of social realism. And I was, what I did, I worked with the art historian Anshuman Dasgupta, who's from Santiniketan, but also an Indian curator, Suman Gopinath. And we commissioned people to make responses to that sculpture. And we also worked with, we had Sheila Gowda in that exhibition, so a friend of Anita. And we also brought in a lot of archives of left practices from India, from the early 20th century, that kind of were sort of, in a way, circulating around that work. And then, several years later, in around 2012, when I was working at Innova, I collaborated again with Kala Bhavan and also with Goldsmiths College, and we set up a research network that had the very sort of horrible title of Tagore Pedagogy in Contemporary Visual Cultures. I mean, it was one of these things that was sort of, you know, it was a grant that we got, but it enabled us to make a network of interested people to visit the school a number of times and think about this question of, you know, what can we learn from this example as educators, as artists, as curators, as different kinds of cultural producers. And then the most recent art school related project, of course, was this one that I worked on, in fact, with collaboration with Regina Bittner from Dessau, which was called Bauhaus Imaginista. And this was the most extraordinary opportunity to travel. It was in collaboration with the late Marion von Osten, an artist and curator, an activist and writer, an all-round very interesting and important person. We were able to travel to many different places and look at different kind of art school models, including Kala Bhavan. And in that exhibition, we juxtaposed pedagogic materials from the early Bauhaus with works from Kala Bhavan, in particular looking at this sort of continuum between the arts and the crafts, and the way that craft was seen as part of a social imaginary by somebody like Tagore. So the most recent project I'm working on, I'll just talk about it quite briefly because it's currently I'm developing it. I'm working with Suman Gopinath, the curator that I mentioned earlier, and we were invited to be part of a project which is called the Color Curtain: The Promise of Bandung, and this project looks at the African and Asian conference that took place in Bandung in 1955. It looks at the conference, but it looks at what preceded the conference and what came after the conference. And so we were invited to think about some of the connections that Rabindranath Tagore was making in the early 20th century as part of his project of trying to develop a kind of Pan-Asian network. So one of these trips was a journey he made with a group to Indonesia in 1927. So this trip is a very interesting story. We researching it through a travelogue that was written by his companion Suniti Chatterjee, who was a linguist from Calcutta. And Chatterjee writes this amazing, very detailed description of that trip, but also through Tagore's own letters, which are these incredible literary works. But the introduction to the translation of the travelogue is written by a woman called Rimli Sengupta, and she gives a very good analysis of this trip and sort of in what ways it succeeded, in what ways it failed. So one of the things that she notes is that Chatterjee was someone that had set up this organization in 1922 called the Greater India Society in Calcutta. And he and Tagore were very interested in researching and figuring out and finding out about this sort of the way that there had been waves of migration in the first millennium to Indonesia from the subcontinent, and the legacy of those movements. And so the trip was partly looking at archaeological sites. So they went to these Hindu Buddhist sites, which were at that time being restored. But they were also interested, and they were presented with examples of sort of cultural practices, dance, puppeteering, that also kind of contain some of this legacy of these migrations. And what Sengupta says is that this particular kind of cultural emphasis of the trip was something that the Dutch colonial organizers of the trip, because the trip, of course, in 1927 was taking place within the colonial framework, both in India and in Indonesia. And so what happened is that while the Dutch and the British were very keen for Tagore to make this connection to cultural sites, cultural practices, they were not at all happy with any kind of discussion of politics, or indeed any kind of connection with the independence movement in Indonesia. And so, as Sengupta writes, the trip was very heavily masterminded. And in this sense, she says it was a missed opportunity. There wasn't the possibility for these activists and independents, people working towards independence, weren't able to meet in that context, except for two occasions when the Dutch minders were absent. One was in Surabaya, when Tagore was visited by 15 independence leaders who came to speak with him. And the second, interestingly, was in Bandung, when Tagore met Sukarno, who went on to become the president of Indonesia. What's also interesting about this encounter is that there's no record of it. So clearly there was some element of censorship which happened. In the travelogue, there's just a very kind of brief description of the fact that these people come to visit Tagore, but no account of the conversation. However, Chatterjee wrote in 1945 in a newspaper, in the Hindustan Standard, he gives an account of what took place in those encounters, but unfortunately that newspaper no longer exists. There are only 2 copies of it, and the second page with the conversation is missing. So this is a kind of historical lacuna. But one of the things that is a very material outcome of the trip, and the thing that we're going to be looking at, or I'm going to be researching in particular, because I also do quite a lot of work in relation to textiles, is the introduction of batik to Santiniketan following that trip. So some of the images which you maybe can see or maybe you can't see on the screen are showing a series of 10 batik works that were brought back by Tagore they were gifted to Tagore during his trip to Indonesia. And these were brought back to Santiniketan, and they were put on public display. So immediately after the trip, materials were shown to the staff and the students, and then they were put in this archive at Kala Bhavan. And this archive at Kala Bhavan I've visited this and I've seen the materials there, and it's an extraordinary collection of sort of transcultural materials which are used in the college as pedagogic tools. So the idea is that students can use these as a reference. So what happened was these materials were brought back, but also Surendranath Kar, who was an artist traveling with Tagore, he made sketches of the batik process, and also Chatterjee gives an account of how batik is made, and this was incorporated into the curriculum by Surendranath Kar and also by Nandalal Bose, who was the first leader of Kala Bhavan, and by his daughter Gauri Bhanja. And in this context, what happens is that the batiks, which came from this sort of very aristocratic context, become a kind of communal practice within a craft revival moment. So this connects very much to the movement of Swadeshi, the idea of self-reliance, and some of the ideas about craft and regeneration that Tagore was developing at the school, and also in a Center for Rural Reconstruction, which was established in 1922 in Sriniketan. What's also interesting is that it's very hard to see, but in the Indonesian batiks, you have this kind of incredible delicacy and finesse, which partly comes from using a pen to decant the wax. So batik is made by applying layers of wax onto fabric and then dip dyeing this, and then doing this repeatedly, so you get these kind of layers of pattern and color. And what happened in Santiniketan, because it was a modernist project, is that it was a modernist project and it was a decolonizing project. And so what happened was that you had the artists starting to apply the batik with a brush, so it becomes a much more freer and expressive form. It becomes like a modern cloth. And also they start to take up and use these symbols and patterns which have kind of contain nationalist sentiments. So I think that perhaps what's interesting about this trip is that even though there was this missed opportunity and this inability to make a connection politically, that maybe some of the textiles smuggle through a kind of politics that takes on its own form. Okay.
Real treat to see those.
Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah.
Oh, is that one? That one's on. Okay. Thank you very much, Grant.
Thank you.
So much packed into a small amount.
Sorry.
I slightly rush ahead in a way and go back and forth a little bit, because one of my favorite poems of Tagore comes from Gitanjali, and there's a line in it that says, "Thy centuries follow one another, perfecting a wild flower." And it seems to me that is very much the approach he had to life and time and pedagogy. At the same time, the pedagogy was so it genuinely was revolutionary, and there was a revolution going on. There was an independence revolution going on. Yeah. So I wondered what you would keep from, as well as this reference to crafts and incorporating them as a bodily learning process. What would you keep from Tagore's ideas for Sriniketan and Santiniketan in particular, which was the art college?
Yeah, I think one of the great things that he said was no curriculum. And it was a kind of, and it's very much in contrast to the Bauhaus, which had this continuously, rewritten curriculum, very complex, very detailed. And I very much like this idea, as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of the unstructured, which I think is really part of art college. When I went to art college, it was this idea of unstructured time, learning in ways that are not necessarily quantifiable. I mean, these are absolutely things that go against the current ethos of education. the idea that you can't quantify. He had this wonderful idea of learning with the senses, which I think is also a Bauhaus thing, with this idea of the haptic, the sensory, being in nature. And then I think what the other thing, I mean, of course, there's an idealism about what's proposed and there's the reality of what happens. Mm-hmm. But I think that what's also super interesting is this idea of kind of consciousness raising, so that education isn't just about learning a skill, it's also about learning how to socialize. How do you function within a community? How do you function in relation to the environment, to a colonial system, industrial capitalism? I mean, these are all things that I think he saw the school as being instrumental in a kind of critique of those things.
That's fascinating. And I think that is something that really is picked up in the film by the Autolith group.
Yeah. There
are some quotations from him saying, I wonder in 100 years from time, what will be the landscape that people are seeing? And even that the title, Zero O Horizon, brings in a lot about his ideas about education. Would you like to tell us about the title?
O Horizon, yes. So O Horizon is actually a level of the soil. During so the project was it was commissioned as part of Bauhaus Imaginista, and it was one of the functions of the film for us. They went on to make their own work, but for us it was very much about sort of bringing some of the campus into the exhibition, and they make this kind of very extended film with that beautiful poem 100 years from now, but they also go to Sriniketan. And they meet a soil scientist. And at that point, the film starts to tap into a kind of ecological project that Tagore was also interested in. So the idea of sustainability, ecology, small scale. And so the soil, I haven't seen this film for a while, and we're all going to watch it, so I may be getting this wrong. But my memory is that the soil scientist is talking about the way that actually Santiniketan was a part of Bengal which was not particularly fertile, and they brought in a lot of soil, and they kind of they developed a sort of an ecology in that place, which is now, as I understand it, eroding. So that's the kind of ecological aspect of the film that I think comes through in the O Horizon.
It's a genuinely holistic, interdisciplinary approach that was, and very few people know about the education ideas that were developed in Santiniketan. And actually, if one reads one of the books in the library, I think is by Devi Prasad, and it's talking about Ram Kinkar Baij's sculptures, which again, the visual language that he uses in these bronze sculptures are very out of their time. And again, they're just not known. We know about so many modernist sculptors, we don't. So there's that aspect of hearing from someone like yourself, and a person who spent a great deal of time there, done a lot of study there. But I think it also, and there's so much more we could unpick. So everyone, please do have a look at the film. It's beautiful. It's very, very absorbing. And large. There are no words. There are very, very few words.
It's actually mostly narrated through texts by Tagore.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So please do have a look at that. But I think we can't really speak about Tagore, and we can't speak about references to Indian philosophy, as I was referring this morning as well, because we have this perennial problem of things becoming, we come across statements that are made that jangle, or more than jangle, that are objectionable. And where do we place those? And I think this is so important at the moment for any of those of us with connections with India, because we are living through a government that is really trying to define Hinduism in a way that is revolting to many of us that were brought up very much in a Vedantic, in the Hindu tradition, which is about openness, which is embracing the critical qualities of Indian philosophy, which would allow us to move on from decrepit old systems such as the caste system, which Kapil has referred to several times. There are so many things that need reform, but it seems at the moment all of those dreadful things are being put forward, and a lot of communalism, as they call it. in India. So racism, communalism, casteism, these have different names, but they're the same sort of dreadful divisive forces. So with Tagore as well, we have his idea of the Pan-Asian culture. And I feel it's very important that we contextualize how he uses the word Aryan. Because I was saying to you that I'm really afraid people will get inspired and will look him up and then say, this man was a fascist. And what he's saying about Aryan culture is disturbing. But what he's saying is slightly different at the same time. So could I give you that difficult task?
Well, yes. I mean, that quote I don't know in particular. I mean, of course, there are lots of problematic things. And when we did our Tagore pedagogy and visual cultures research project, one of the participants was an art historian called Adrian Rifkin. And he made a performance called Fragmenting Tagore, which kind of brought a lot of it kind of trawled through all of the problematic things that Tagore said as a kind of counterweight to our enthusiasm. And I mean, there are things like, for example, Spivak says that, there's this kind of idea of sort of enlightened philanthropy, kind of sort of entrepreneurship, charity, which, and kind of liberal humanism, all of those things are there. But I suppose I'm not a Tagore scholar. I mean, he's a very, very complex character, and it has written many things. And one of the things that I was reading yesterday, in fact, in preparation for this, was an article by a Marxist scholar called Himani Banerjee, who started writing about Tagore, and it seemed like an unlikely unlikely subject for her, actually. Most of her work is around feminism, Marxist feminism. And anyway, in this article, she talks about Tagore. She talks about Santiniketan as Vishva Bharati as a project of, she calls it pedagogic decolonization. But she also goes into some detail about Tagore's trip to the Soviet Union. And, of course, Tagore went to Italy. He met Mussolini. He was enthusiastic. He also went to the Soviet Union, and he was enthusiastic about that, and wrote incredible letters about his experience of education in the Soviet Union and the way that masses of people were being educated. This kind of mass of peasants were being educated in this incredible push. He was very impressed by the way that feudalism was being destroyed, because he saw that as a problem also for him in India, this kind of feudal system. And he was also very impressed by their attack on religion. So he says, religion has been used for millennia to oppress the peasants. And, I think that, so I suppose one could probably find writings that appeal to you and kind of connect to your own belief system, and you can equally find ones that are going to really put you off. But I think that one thing that Banerjee says is, we may not agree with everything he says, but we can definitely learn from his radical pedagogy.
Yes, we can learn from his pedagogy, and also I think when one looks at his short stories, and plays, they are full of humanity, and it is searing critiques of all the disturbing elements of Indian culture that he wants to change, and he wants to use the education project as a means of developing these critical thinkers. So it's very complex, and what he talks about is, this is also a moment when India is trying to define itself as a new nation. Against 300 years of being told that there is nothing in Indian culture. So what he's trying to say is that there is this Pan-Asian culture, and that the subcontinent of Asia is at the pinnacle of this achievement. But it is very much at odds with Ruskin's idea, which puts European culture at the pinnacle. And it is aeons away from Hitler's idea of Aryan civilization. But the Aryan invasion theory is something we don't have time to go into, but it is something that was generally believed about the history of India, that there was this external group of invaders that took over from the indigenous Dravidian culture and developed what became. Tagore is saying what you have is an amalgamation of both, and neither could have existed without the other. there are still problematic things, but I think we couldn't have talked about him without saying it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
at the same time, there is so much. So if you're interested, Gitanjali, the short stories,
Yeah.
Grant's
Letters,
research,
I
there's so
think, are
much.
really-
Letters,
yeah.
yes. Wonderful
Yeah.
statements. And,
Yeah.
yeah. Was that 5 minutes up or 5 minutes to go?
That was 5 minutes to go, so 2 minutes.
Ah, okay.
I think, well, I would just mention the letters, especially these letters that are written in Indonesia. I mean, they're really amazing. They're like this kind of person with this sort of antennae, very sensitive, but also very funny. I mean, there's one letter where he describes himself as being like a popcorn machine, because he says, I'm just wheeled out, I'm made to speak. And because he was also fundraising for his college, because the college was continuously running out of money, and so he was famous for his poetry. He'd won the Nobel Prize, and he did these tours to make money, and that was also part of it. And he said, I'm just wheeled out. I'm like this popcorn machine that's just switched on, and I just vomit popcorn. And then there was another very good metaphor where he talks about the colonial administration being like a milking machine that's just kind of extracting continuously and bleeding dry, So I think those letters are really powerful, and I recommend people read them if they get the chance. Yeah.
Yes, and songs. There are so many.
Yeah.
This is the Rabindra Sangeet, the
Yeah.
tradition of that, which also features in the film.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ram. Thank you.